Worth is a thing not often measured in noise. In the vast, quiet lands of the frontier, a man was judged by the straightness of his fence line, the health of his stock, and the silence he kept in the face of hardship. A woman, they said, was judged by the warmth of her hearth and the quickness of her tongue. By that measure, the world had found Mei Lin wanting. But the world was often a fool, blind to the strength that grew in the deepest quiet. Elias Thorne knew about quiet. It was the soil his life was planted in, the vast and lonely field of his days. His ranch was tucked away in a fold of the Montana foothills, a place where the wind spoke more often than men, and the sky was a brutal, beautiful canvas of passing moods. For 5 years since Martha's passing, the silence had been his only companion, a steady presence that had hollowed him out, and then, strangely, filled him back up with a kind of rugged peace. He was a man shaped by labor and loss, his hands calloused from leather reins and cedar posts, his face a road map of sun and sorrow. His movements were deliberate, economical. He rose before the sun painted the eastern peaks, his first thought the well-being of his horses, his last the security of his locks. This spring the land was awakening with a slow, aching grace. Patches of stubborn snow still clung to the shaded hollows, but the creek was running high and loud, and the first green shoots of bunch grass were pushing through the cold earth. It was a season of unforgiving hope, a promise that life, however hard-pressed, would endure. Elias was mending a stretch of fence near the southern pasture when he saw the rider, a small, dark speck against the enormous landscape. Visitors were rare and seldom welcome. They brought news of a world he'd left behind, a world of chatter and judgment that had no place in his well-ordered solitude. He set his jaw, driving a final staple into the post with a single, forceful blow. He did not wave. He did not call out. He simply waited, a figure of stoic patience, while the outside world rode steadily, inexorably, toward his gate. The rider brought a letter from the pastor in Cottonwood Creek, the small, dusty settlement Elias visited only twice a year for supplies. He read the crisp paper, its neat script a stark contrast to his own rough-hewn existence. It spoke of a bride-to-be, a young woman from China, arranged to marry a local merchant. But there was a problem, the pastor wrote, a complication. Elias crumpled the letter in his fist. He knew the merchant, a man named Abernathy, whose piety was as loud and hollow as a new tin bucket. Complications were Abernathy's stock in trade. Still, it was not his concern. He had his fences, his cattle, the coming thaw. But a phrase near the bottom of the page snagged in his mind. The girl is alone. There is nowhere for her to go. He saddled his horse the next morning, the decision sitting in his gut like a cold stone. He hated the town, its narrow streets and narrower minds, the way people's eyes slid over him, sizing up his solitude and finding it a kind of madness. When he rode in, he saw the scene at once, gathered outside Abernathy's mercantile. Abernathy himself, red-faced and puffed with indignation, was gesturing at a small, still figure standing on the boardwalk. It was the girl, Mei Lin. She wore a simple white prairie dress, clean but rumpled from travel, the color of a late spring snow. Her hair was a braid of polished jet, her hands clasped before her, her gaze fixed on the dusty planks at her feet. "She's a mute, I reckon," Abernathy boomed, for the benefit of the gathering crowd. "Or a simpleton. Hasn't said 2 words since she arrived. I need a wife, a helpmeet, not a china doll to sit on a shelf. She's too shy, too foreign. I'm sending her back." The townspeople murmured, a mix of pity and suspicion. Mei Lin did not flinch. She did not look up. She simply stood in the eye of their storm, a vessel of profound and unbreakable calm. Elias watched from across the street. He saw not weakness, but a rare and formidable stillness. He knew the cost of words, how easily they could be twisted, how little they often meant. In her silence, he recognized a language he understood. He swung down from his horse, the squeak of his saddle leather cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Every eye turned to him as he walked across the dusty street, his steps slow and measured. The townsfolk parted before him like dry grass. He was a ghost from the hills, a man they spoke of in whispers, and his sudden presence was a shock. He stopped before Abernathy, his shadow falling over the smaller man. He was not tall, but he was broad, solid as the land he worked. He ignored the merchant and looked at the girl. For the first time, she lifted her head, and her eyes, dark and deep as a well, met his. There was no fear in them, only a quiet, waiting exhaustion. "What's the trouble, Abernathy?" Elias's voice was rough, rusted from disuse. Abernathy sputtered, thrown off balance. "Thorne, this is no business of yours. The girl, she is unsuitable. The arrangement is void." Elias held her gaze for a moment longer before turning his eyes, cold as creek water, back to the merchant. "What was the price?" he asked. The question hung in the air, plain and brutal. Abernathy's jaw worked. "The passage and a fee to the agent." Elias reached into his coat, his movements unhurried. He pulled out a worn leather pouch and counted out the coins onto a nearby barrel head, the clink of silver silencing all other sound. "The debt is paid," Elias said. "She'll come with me." A gasp went through the crowd. Abernathy stared, his mouth agape. The girl, Maylene, looked from the coins to Elias's face, a flicker of disbelief in her dark eyes. Elias offered her his hand. It was a gesture of transaction, not tenderness. After a long moment of hesitation, she placed her small, cool hand in his calloused one. He helped her onto his horse, settling her in front of him, and then mounted behind. He did not look back at the stunned faces of the town as he turned the horse and rode away, the girl's slight weight against his chest a strange and unsettling burden. The journey back to the ranch was long and silent, broken only by the plodding of the horse's hooves and the cry of a distant hawk. He felt her stillness, the rigid line of her spine, and knew it for the armor it was. They arrived as dusk was bleeding purple and orange across the sky. The cabin looked stark and lonely, a smudge of smoke rising from its stone chimney into the vast emptiness. Elias slid from the horse and lifted her down. Her feet touched the earth of her new home, and she stood for a moment, taking in the raw, untamed beauty of the place. It was a world away from the crowded ports and villages she had known. He led her inside. The cabin was one room, spare and clean, dominated by a large stone hearth. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat in the center. In the corner was a bed, his bed. On the opposite side, a small cot had been hastily set up, a clean but threadbare blanket folded neatly upon it. "This is yours," he said, gesturing to the cot. It was the first thing he'd said to her since leaving town. She gave a small, jerky nod, her eyes darting around the space, assessing every detail. She clutched the small cloth bundle that held all her worldly possessions. The first days passed in a quiet, observational rhythm. Elias rose at his usual hour, moving with the quiet competence of a man who knows his tasks. He worked outside from dawn till dusk. He expected nothing from her, offered nothing but the shelter of his roof and a place at his table. He left her to find her own space in his silence, and she did. On the second day, he came in from the fields, bone-weary and splattered with mud, to find the cabin transformed. The floor was swept clean, his tin plates washed and stacked, and a pot of something simmered over the fire, filling the small space with an unfamiliar, savory aroma. She had taken his meager stores, some dried beans, a little salt pork, an onion, and made a stew that tasted of comfort and care. He sat and ate without a word, but his gaze lingered on her. The next day, he found his favorite work shirt, the one with the tear in the elbow he'd never found time to mend, laid out on his bed. He picked it up. The tear was gone, replaced by a seam of such tiny perfect stitches that it was nearly invisible. It was stronger than the original fabric. He ran his thumb over the intricate work. It was a message, a statement of worth written in thread. That evening, he left a small bucket of milk from his lone dairy cow by the door for her, still warm. It was his reply. A week passed, then 2. The unspoken language between them grew richer, more nuanced. He learned the meaning of the wildflower she sometimes placed in a jar on the table. Yellow for a sunny day, purple for the encroaching twilight. She learned the sounds of his return, the heavy tread of his boots on the porch, the weary sigh as he hung his hat on the peg. They orbited each other in the small cabin, 2 solitary planets slowly drawn into a shared gravity. Trust was not a word spoken, but a structure built, piece by piece, through shared labor. One afternoon, a sudden spring storm rolled in from the west, the sky turning a bruised, violent gray. Elias had been mending a harness and saw the change too late. A ferocious wind tore through the valley, and the rain came down in blinding sheets. He cursed under his breath. The new lambs, born just days before, were in the far pasture with their mothers, sheltered only by a small, rocky overhang. They would scatter in a panic, or the cold. Driving rain would be the death of them. He grabbed his oilskin coat and a lantern, shouting over the wind, "Stay inside, bolt the door." But as he stepped out into the maelstrom, he saw she was right behind him, a heavy wool blanket clutched in her hands, and his own spare coat pulled tight around her small frame. Her hair was instantly plastered to her face, but her expression was resolute. She did not flinch from the storm. He hesitated for only a second before nodding. They fought their way through the wind and mud, the lantern light a feeble dancing speck in the roaring dark. They found the ewes huddled and bleeding, the lambs shivering and soaked. Without a word, they began their work. He cornered the panicked animals, his strength a bulwark against their fear. She moved with surprising quickness, gathering the smallest, weakest lambs, wrapping them in the thick, dry wool of the blanket. Her hands, which he had thought delicate, were steady and sure. They worked in perfect, silent unison, a dance of shared purpose against the fury of nature, until every last lamb was accounted for and herded into the relative safety of the barn. Back in the cabin, the storm still raged outside, but within the thick log walls, a fragile new world was taking shape. They were soaked to the bone, their clothes heavy with rain and mud, their bodies trembling with cold and exhaustion. A fire already roared in the hearth, the one small mercy Mei Lin had prepared before they'd charged into the gale. Elias moved with a grim efficiency, stripping off his wet oilskin and hanging it by the door. He turned to her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "Get out of those wet things," he said, his voice a low rumble. He turned his back to give her privacy, focusing on stoking the fire until it blazed with a fierce, consuming heat. He heard the rustle of wet fabric, the soft pad of her bare feet on the wooden floor. When he turned back, she was wrapped in one of the thick wool blankets from his bed, her small frame nearly lost in its folds. Her wet dress lay in a heap by the hearth to dry. He handed her a tin mug of coffee he had brewed, strong and black, and laced with a little whiskey for warmth. Her fingers brushed against his as she took it, a spark of contact that was more startling than the lightning outside. He saw then a long, shallow cut on the back of her hand, red and angry against her pale skin, likely scraped on a rock in the chaos. He said nothing. He simply went to his small medicine chest and came back with a clean cloth and a jar of salve. He knelt before her where she sat on the small stool by the fire. He took her hand gently in his. Her skin was so soft beneath the calluses of his own. He cleaned the wound with a tenderness that felt foreign and clumsy in his large, rough hands. She watched his face, her dark eyes searching his, seeing the deep lines of concern etched around his eyes. She had never been touched with such deliberate, selfless care. As he worked, the fury of the storm began to subside, its rage spent. The wind quieted to a mournful sigh, and the rain softened to a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof. The only sounds in the cabin were the crackle of the fire and their own quiet breathing. He finished tying a strip of clean linen around the bandage, and his hand lingered on hers for a beat too long. A current passed between them in that silence, an acknowledgment of the shared danger, the mutual reliance. He had seen her strength, and she had seen his gentleness. He finally released her hand and rose, his movements stiff. The air was thick with things unsaid, with a new awareness that had fundamentally altered the space between them. The morning after the storm broke clear and dazzling, the air washed clean and smelling of damp earth and pine. The world outside seemed remade, and inside the small cabin something had been remade as well. The silence that had once been a barrier of solitude was now a vessel of shared understanding. It was a comfortable, breathing thing, filled not with emptiness, but with unspoken trust. Elias found himself changing his routines. He no longer simply left for his work, but would pause at the door, catching her eye, a silent question passing between them. He started talking more, not about feelings, but about the land, the work. He took her with him to check the fence lines, showing her how to spot a loose wire or a post weakened by the wet ground. He pointed out the tracks of a deer, the nest of a hawk high in a cottonwood. He was teaching her the language of his world, and she proved to be a quick and silent student, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Her hands, he learned, were as capable with a pair of fencing pliers as they were with a needle and thread. In return, she brought a quiet life to the harsh edges of his existence. One afternoon, he came back to the cabin to find she had tilled a small patch of earth near the porch. Using seeds she must have carried with her in her small bundle, she was starting a garden. He watched her from the barn, her small figure bent over the dark soil, her hands working with a patient, loving care. A soft, unfamiliar melody drifted on the breeze. She was humming, a low, ancient-sounding tune that spoke of places he could not imagine. A strange feeling tightened in his chest, a fierce, protective ache that was more than just gratitude for a warm meal and a mended shirt. It was the feeling of watching something precious and beautiful take root in his own barren ground. That evening, as they sat at the table for supper, he brought out a small, crudely made stool he had fashioned years ago for Martha. He placed it by the hearth. "For your garden work," he said, his voice gruff, "so you don't have to kneel in the mud." Maylin looked at the stool, then up at him, and for the first time he saw the corners of her mouth lift in a small, hesitant smile. It was like seeing the sun rise after a long, dark night, and it struck him right through the heart. The time came when their supplies ran low. Flour, salt, coffee, the staples of their simple life were dwindling, and a trip to Cottonwood Creek was unavoidable. A knot of unease tightened in Elias's stomach at the thought. To leave her alone on the ranch felt wrong, a betrayal of the protective instinct that now governed his days. But to take her back to that town, to subject her to the prying eyes and cruel whispers of people like Abernathy, felt just as wrong. He wrestled with it for 2 days, the decision weighing on him. In the end, it was Maylin who decided it. He was loading the wagon with a few hides for trade when he saw her emerge from the cabin, wearing the same clean white dress she had arrived in, a simple bonnet on her head. She carried a small basket, her expression calm and resolved. She did not ask to go. She simply stood by the wagon, ready. She would not hide. She would not be treated like a shameful secret. Elias looked at her, at the quiet dignity that radiated from her small frame, and felt a surge of pride. He gave a short, sharp nod and helped her up onto the wagon seat. The ride to town was tense. As they neared the settlement, he could feel her stiffen beside him, her hands clutching her basket tightly. He wanted to say something reassuring, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply moved his arm until it was pressed lightly against hers, a small, solid point of contact. The town was just as he remembered, dusty, noisy, and judgmental. Heads turned as they rode down the main street. Whispers followed them like stirred-up dirt. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, his jaw set. He pulled the wagon up in front of the general store, deliberately avoiding Abernathy's mercantile across the street. As he helped her down, the store owner, a weary-looking man named Henderson, gave them a curious but not unkind look. Inside, while Elias negotiated for his supplies, Maylin moved quietly through the aisles. She examined bolts of calico cloth with a discerning eye and picked out a small bag of rock candy, her expression unreadable. Just as they were about to leave, the bell above the door jangled and Abernathy walked in. His eyes landed on them, and a smug, nasty smile spread across his face. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Thorne, I see you still have my charity case with you. Has she learned to speak yet, or does she just cook and sew like a good little doll?" Elias went rigid, his hands clenching into fists. But before he could utter the furious retort rising in his throat, he felt a small, firm pressure on his arm. It was Maylin. She stood beside him, her back straight, and looked directly at Abernathy. She said nothing. Her silence was not shy or fearful. It was immense, a quiet condemnation that was more powerful than any shout. Elias relaxed his fists. He looked down at her, then back at the sputtering merchant. He laid his hand gently on the small of her back, a simple, possessive gesture that was a declaration to the entire town. "We're done here," he said to Henderson, paid for his goods, and guided Maylin out of the store, leaving Abernathy standing alone in a sea of silent disapproval. The public display of solidarity had cost them. Abernathy was not a man to suffer humiliation, especially from a silent girl and a reclusive rancher. 2 days later, as the sun began its slow descent behind the mountains, 3 riders appeared on the horizon, heading straight for the ranch. Elias recognized Abernathy's stout figure immediately. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, settled in his gut. He had known this was coming. He met them on the porch, his rifle held loosely but ready at his side. Maylin was inside, but he knew she was watching from the window. "Thorne," Abernathy called out, pulling his horse to a halt a few yards away. The 2 men with him were hired thugs, their faces hard and empty. "We've come on a matter of principle. There are concerns in town about this woman's welfare. Living out here with a man like you, it ain't proper. We're here to take her back, where she can be cared for by decent folk." The lie was so transparent it was insulting. This was about power, about Abernathy reasserting his perceived status. "She is my concern," Elias said, his voice flat and dangerous. "This is my land. You're not welcome here. Turn around and ride out." Abernathy sneered. "I have a bill of sale for her passage, Thorne. Legally my claim was first. You interfered. Now I'm taking what's mine." One of the thugs began to dismount, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. In that split second, the cabin door opened. Maylin stepped out. She held Elias's heavy shotgun, its twin barrels pointing at the ground. Her face was a mask of cold fury. She walked to Elias's side, her movements fluid and unafraid. She didn't look at the men. She looked at Elias, her eyes conveying a world of trust and resolve. She pressed the stock of the shotgun into his hand. Her touch was electric. Then she turned her gaze upon Abernathy, and for the first time since he had met her, she spoke in English. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tense air like a knife. "He is not decent," she said, her accent thick but the words clear as a bell. "You're not welcome. Leave this place." The shock of her voice, the sheer force of her will, stunned the men into silence. Abernathy's jaw dropped. Seeing his advantage, Elias raised the shotgun, the metallic click of the hammers being cocked echoing in the sudden stillness. "You heard her," he growled. "Get off my land. Now." The riders exchanged nervous glances. They were paid bullies, not men willing to die for Abernathy's pride. Defeated, Abernathy wheeled his horse around, spitting a curse into the dust. They galloped away, their retreat a cloud of dust and cowardice against the setting sun. They stood on the porch for a long time after the riders had vanished, the heavy shotgun still warm in Elias's hands. The vast silence of the prairie settled back around them, but this time it was different. It was a silence they had earned, a peace they had fought for together. The adrenaline slowly receded, leaving behind a raw and potent clarity. He finally lowered the weapon and leaned it against the cabin wall. He turned to face her, the last light of the day catching the fierce, beautiful strength in her eyes. All the barriers he had built around his heart, all the walls of grief and solitude, had crumbled to dust. He saw her not as a refugee he had rescued, but as the woman who had stood beside him, who had armed him, who had given him a voice when his own was choked with rage. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. It was a gesture of awe, of reverence. "Maylin," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. He had never said it aloud before. It felt right. He struggled for the words, the unfamiliar currency of emotion feeling thick in his mouth. "They were never going to take you." Her hand came up to cover his, her touch soft and sure. She looked up at him, her dark eyes holding his, a universe of understanding passing between them. "I know," she whispered, her voice still a marvel to him. "This is my home." It was a vow, a declaration more binding than any preacher's words or legal document. It was a truth that had grown between them in the silent language of shared work, mended clothes, and a stand against the world. He leaned down and gently pressed his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. He could feel her quiet breathing, could smell the scent of wood smoke and wild herbs in her hair. It was the scent of belonging. If this story touched you, perhaps you understand that a home is not four walls, but the safe harbor found in another's heart. Elias Thorne, a man who had thought his life was over, was just beginning to build his. He opened his eyes and looked out at the land, his land, their land, as the first stars began to appear in the deep velvet of the sky. It was no longer a place of lonely exile. It was a kingdom for two, vast and quiet and full of hope.